Here we are at University of Houston main campus. Wanted to show you one of the new projects. This really talks about native trees, native plant material. And here on the roadside we incorporated native plants as a part of the bioswale construction, which actually takes the stormwater from the roadway into the drainage system. Planted trees here are red maple. This grows more vertically rather than horizontally, which is good for the roadside, and then in the relationship to the architecture, it's here. Part of the super tree selections. It has interesting characteristics as a fall color, but also in the springtime it turns bright red as a part of the flowering cycle. The bioswale is a function of taking the stormwater into this basin rather than directly going into the stormwater pipe. This allows for part of the detention system to minimize the effect of stormwater flooding. At the same time, the bioswale helps cleanse the water. So in it are palmetto, which likes a little bit of a wet soil, frog fruit as a ground cover, and then we have some native grasses like the muley grass here. The university has adopted a fairly strong sort of a policy in terms of preserving all the trees possible. Preserving large trees really has tremendous amount of a benefit when it comes to the environmental side of it than planting small trees all the time. So preservation is the #1 priority. To that point, we introduced, at the great expense really, providing wood decking to minimize the effect of development on existing trees. Mature trees provide benefit for carbon sequestration. I mean, it does a whole lot more than the small trees, obviously. Houston, as a part of the bird's migratory path, well, it provides for not only the place for birds to rest, but it provides for food as well. When we're talking about urban heat islands, well, this mature trees provides a lot of a benefit when it comes to heat island. We talk a lot about public health these days, and we know today that where the mature trees are, that's where you have a public health benefits. So, and then that has a lot to do with the air quality as well. So if we want to make Houston a more livable place, we need to preserve large trees and preserve that ecological benefit that large trees provide. For this building, which is a garage structure for U of H, but it really sits at the entrance, main entrance of U of H. Part of the detention requirement, we have to create large depression area. Of course, at the entrance, why not provide large water body for visual effect? This is a way to provide habitat and then provide kind of a tree species that wants to be near these kinds of habitats for its full effect and benefits. There are some challenges, obviously, in maintenance and the installation side of it, but as long as you understand all of that, this gives back a whole lot to the people who are engaged in the facility or just a passerby. So I want to talk a little bit about river birch trees, and I know it's one of the super trees. It is native, it likes water, it grows well along the streams and bayous. Real native will have a one root system with a multiple trunk. That's the sort of the true definition of a multi-trunk trees. I doubt that these are a true multi-trunk, but rather they were 3 little plants planted together. You can specify single trunk tree as well. The river birch will tend to have these dead branches. And make sure when the branches like this is to take it down to the trunk. One of the things that you have to be careful is that when you river birch is a little sensitive to trimming. So make sure that you don't hop the tree, but rather try to prune from the inside and then to control the dead woods. Otherwise, river birch is fast growing. It really provides nice wispy look to it, and it adds in contrast with other trees. It's a nice addition to gardens or any development or any environment. The bull cypress is a native tree. It thrives obviously in a very wet environment, but at the same time it tolerates drought quite a bit. It does go a little bit brown like this in the summertime because of the heat stress, but it's perfectly fine. This is part of the way this tree grows. And it also provides very vivid color in the fall. So add that in addition to the super tree.
Starting in this city 36 years ago, the city is a very different place today than it was. There's much more emphasis and concern about quality of life issues, green space issues, and building those spaces for people to get outdoors. And linked strongly to that is creating more shade and more canopy throughout the city. I think it's safe to say that we've been responsible for specifying and drawing on plans in this region tens and tens of thousands of trees. And we'd like to, consider that that is helping the overall quality of life, but also bringing down the heat island effect, especially in the urban areas. And these projects happen in many different sectors: streetscapes, parking lots, parks. We just came across a really interesting recent statistic out of an urban study for tree canopy. Good tree canopy in an urban setting can reduce the summer temperature by 7 degrees. There's some statistics showing throughout the overall city, it then can reduce the cities by 2 degrees. So one of the reasons these studies are coming out touches on the idea of equity. So poorer neighborhoods have fewer trees in general. And those are hotter places. So if we go back into those underprivileged, poorer neighborhoods and we add that tree canopy, we are improving every one of those people's quality of life. And there's also more deaths in this region from heat stroke than there are from many other conditions, including natural disasters. There's a much more of a focus on native materials, different sizes, trying to get a different mix, not get the monocultures that we've seen throughout this region for many years. And as beautiful as a lot of those areas are, like South and North Boulevard, they are a monoculture nonetheless. So working with some of these super trees and the native species and creating more environments to do those and do them well is a very important trend we're seeing. Behind me is a picture of Springwoods Village, which is the development south of the Woodlands. The goal for that project was to be extremely focused on using native species. It already had existing loblolly pines that you see in East Texas in the piney woods, but we were supporting that and adding other native species, hollies, magnolias, sweet gums, to that entire mix and enriching that forest so there was more diversity. They also were very committed to not just a native tree basis for our planting design, but also to recreate and establish prairie plantings. Several projects that we worked on in the west side of town, Cinco Ranch, Grand Lakes, large-scale master plan communities that were old agricultural lands. They were not virgin prairies. They were really overgrazed agricultural lands. So we specified and planted, again, thousands and thousands of trees. So all of a sudden it's gone from this intense heat that we're trying to manage into a neighborhood where you can really be outside and play throughout the year, even in this time of the year in July and August. So I think the cumulative effect is what we're getting at, that as we continue to work on projects both outside in the suburban community, as well as certainly infill inside the loop, inside Beltway 8. It's really important that we find places for those trees. And another thing that's become more and more evident with research and statistics and data is talking about urban trees and being mindful of the horticultural requirements for each tree to reach its full potential. We can look at many examples around town where there's a small tree planted in a small space and it never really reaches its scale or its size or its glory. So there's plenty of evidence and scientific research showing how much horticultural medium you need to have a successful urban tree that is going to be here for 50, 75, 100 years. I've been very involved as a board member and past president of the Trees for Houston organization, and our goal is to promote increasing canopy and planting as many trees in this region as possible. And the partnerships that have come out of Trees for Houston are addressing a lot of different areas. It's not just about street tree plantings for Trees for Houston. It is also partnering with parks like Memorial Park, Herman Park, big parks, little parks. It's partnering with schools to get schools with shade and adding those. So it's schools and parks and streetscapes, and it's a combination of helping plant those trees, and a huge amount of that work is done with volunteers. We have to not just think about new, we also have to think about replacement. And where that's happening in places like the Houston Arboretum, the brand new botanic garden that was just finished, which is showcasing quite a range of different species to sort of test our climate a little bit too, and introduce new things. And there's a whole piece of those projects and other green groups within our whole area that is one of education. So we really have to educate the public that, you know, not every shade tree is a live oak, that there are many, many other options that give us color and texture and fall color and flowers. And so I think all of the organizations that are involved in helping add to the overall canopy of Houston are also doing a great service, and they're educating the public about what the options are. Our firm helped author a book called The 9 Natives for Sun and the 9 Natives for Shade, and it's a publication that anybody can access, and that was another educational tool to show people what else is out there besides Indian hawthorn and liriope. We have in our firm for sure, and other firms around this region, really tried to look for perennials, native grasses, things that have less maintenance. One of the biggest costs in maintenance on these big landscapes is mowing. So you're using a lawnmower, you're using gasoline, and if you could go do those big open spaces that aren't being used for recreation, are really a beautification and a absorption, adding like sponges to our landscape. That is why we see the trends of native plant materials.
There's also smaller spaces, whether they're residential or corporate, to take advantage of making another space and really utilizing trees to create placemaking. Here at our studio, which I'm standing outside on our deck, we had a series of really beautiful old loblolly pines, and we'd lost a few and decided that maybe we should just go ahead and add to that and do in this case a grove of a single species. We have other species around the campus, but in this particular area we thought we would build on those beautiful existing loblolly pines. They go tall and narrow, so you can keep the views clear and open. If you're worried about crime areas or people hiding, you get this idea of high canopy. This is the south side of our building, and so we really wanted to shade. Here we are in this very hot climate. I have a flat roof on this building, and so it takes a lot of heat. So already the south side of the building is benefiting from the shade that this grove is offering to our utility bills. So that's another advantage of proper tree placement on different sides of your properties and buildings. One of the great initiatives that's happened in the last 5 years in Houston, Texas, as many of you know, is the Bayous 2020 program. So it's a public-private partnership that is resulting in just this past year finishing building 150 miles of trails along our bayou systems. Many firms in town have been involved in that, and Clark Connon has been lucky to be involved in several halls and greens. Bayous have been part of our focus. And so even though there are trees along those unchannelized bayous, there's new areas we're creating, trailheads, access points. And so that's giving us another opportunity to add to the tree canopy, and that gives us a great opportunity to showcase species. We are also looking at cues within those bayou riparian areas. What is growing there, and then picking that plant material and showcasing that, whether it's a fringe tree, a native holly, a native sweet gum. We're bringing those out into this areas, and we're also adding some education about those and what are those species, so people start to recognize them when they're enjoying biking or walking along all of these new trail corridors that we have.
As a landscape designer, one of the best things I get to do is basically dream about trees and plant trees on a daily basis, and it's a very rewarding experience. In the City of Houston and the Houston Wilderness Initiative for tree planting, there's significant opportunities to expand the tree canopy and planting within master plan communities. Two clients, Johnson Development and Howard Hughes, have made a large commitment to planting trees in two very different ways. I'm going to talk about two different sites today. The first one being Prairieland Village by Howard Hughes, and the second one being Fluellen Creek by Johnson Development. Each of them are related to water, and each of them exist within a master plan community. In this particular case, we're looking at low impact development, so how water courses through a system in an attempt to slow down the water, filter the water, and maximize the benefit within the project. And when it comes to tree planting and a lot of the projects that we work on, there's a strong connection between the trees and the water. In this particular case, you can see behind me, very much under construction. This project has been under construction within the last 6 months. The amazing transformation as it grows in. But right now we're looking at one of the bioswale features, one of the water treatment features that takes the water from the street, stormwater runoff, and filters it, and then treats it, detains it, slows it down, and eventually goes into a bigger detention system. And in this particular case, trees have been used to frame the space, create a diversity of species, which also creates a diversity of life. We're not thinking about just one singular tree, we're really thinking about bigger systems. And in this particular case, the system is the edge of the bioswales. And so you'll see reforestation, you'll see singular trees, and really a diversity of species with the intention to create habitat at the edge of these really important ecological zones. And one of the really interesting things coming out here was, as we were walking to this particular location, it was pretty cool to walk along the edge of the forest, and the amount of dragonflies, butterflies, and birds that were part of this bigger system is really a major function to how we approach tree planting. In a master plan community setting that we're in right now, thinking about planting trees growing up, really the magic is when you plant the tree, tiny sapling, and you come back 10 years later and seeing that growth and that difference that it makes in the environment. So this particular project, very much in its infancy, it's going to be very exciting to come back and see the residents here in full maturity and realizing the full benefits of the ecosystem services associated with the trees. The second project site is Fluellen Creek at Cross Creek Ranch, a Johnson Development project. And so continuing the theme of water, just actually had a rainstorm. You may see the trees dripping, sort of one of the kind of magical moments of trees after the rainstorm. You can hear some of the wildlife perhaps in the background. Similar to the Bridgeland project, this project is very much about uniting trees with water. This particular project was a 3-mile long, 150-acre creek restoration. And versus Bridgeland, we looked at some of the newer plantings there and the future transformation. This project is actually over a decade old, and just kind of can see the magic of the scenery behind me and the impacts that trees make on the project site. Part of the process here was really thinking about the role that each tree plays within a bigger system, within sort of that niche within ecology. And so we looked at planting a lot of different tree species, broke them out into upland forestation areas, bottomland forestation areas. The creek itself meanders with fluvial geomorphologic principles, so you can see kind of that meandering stream. It's framed by trees. And then another really interesting aspect to this project is the way that the water enters the stream system. We have a series of what are called plunge pools, and each of those plunge pools are framed by a special tree planting as well. So when planning for this kind of restoration effort, we put a lot of time into thinking about the different zones that trees would fit. In this particular case, we use trees in an interesting way. Along the bottom of the creek, we actually use them to hold the banks, create stabilization, control erosion. And then in addition to those trees, we actually had some trees from Hurricane Ike that were trees that had died, that we planted as standing snags and other features for the wildlife within the project site. These kind of projects, you can see 10 years create really magical spaces. And so I think with the tree planting initiative that we're talking about, whether it's master plan communities, whether it's public, whether it's private, trees really play a key role within our region and create dynamic spaces that are not only valuable from the ecology standpoint, but create wonderful quality of life amenities for the community as a whole.
Awesome. Thank you. There's so much good information in there. I'm going to let everybody get on. All our panelists, there they all are. Fabulous. Thank you for all that fabulous information that's on the video. As I mentioned before we got started and showing the video, that we're going to have a little panel discussion, mostly them, not me. I may ask them the questions, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So feel free to use the Q&A box there for any questions that anybody may have. And then as we round out, we'll do all this for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll finalize it. And I will do a few housekeeping matters about places you can find these videos and that kind of thing. But let's go ahead and start the panel. So that'll be fun. It looks like we're starting to get some questions in, which is great. You all might want to talk a little bit more. And by the way, these panel discussions are going to be related to deeper dives on some things that were discussed in the video, just an opportunity to go a little deeper. So you all mentioned avoiding deforestation, which is as critical as adding additional trees. So I'd like to open it up and just get a little more detail on perhaps ways that people might avoid that kind of deforestation, things they might want to look at in trying to keep the trees they have.
Can I start first here about the avoiding deforestation? I mean, the existing tree canopies really provides a lot of benefit to the region, and I think it's really important to keep as many existing trees as possible, or as many existing sort of the ecosystem as possible, whether it's in the wet area or the upland plant trees. There are many areas. And what I think is that we need stronger policy at local level about really preserving those trees and preserving those edges that the forest provides. And really, when you start to denude that landscape, and then you're really providing for invasive species to come in, and it's really a difficult cycle to put back sort of the native land again. So I know we only provide protection for right-of-way trees and some protections only in the setback areas, but I think we should provide protection for all the trees, especially significant large trees or significant stands of trees. And you know, I know we're kind of the developer-friendly city, but I think we need to really think about the, like Sheila was saying, about the equity and all of that, about all of the communities' quality of life, and then it really should start from preserving trees.
I just want to add one thing. It's just also really important to talk about that at the really early stages of the project. Sometimes people have good intentions and they say, oh, I'm going to put a little, fence around XYZ tree, but it's really got to be looked at as part of the overall ecosystem and have enough room and have time to get out ahead of it. And in many cases, treat the trees during construction, protect them. It's just not enough to say, I'm going to leave that tree. So it's being very proactive to make it the most successful.
So I'll add a couple of comments. So I think policy is important. Thinking about Houston is certainly a city of trees. It's also a city of water. And thinking about tree preservation, a lot of the projects we deal with are removing trees, and that's where the trees are, by the water, and it's for detention purposes. So I think thinking about our detention policies and finding ways that we can preserve those trees, but also alternative ways other than some of these gigantic basins. Maybe it's low impact development, and really looking at our water systems so that the grading concerns and the water movement concerns also enable us to save additional trees as well.
That's great. Well, Houston Wilderness is all in on supporting policies associated with those efforts. I appreciate those comments on that. How about, you all kind of touched on this, how about locations of plantings generally? Are there areas where you feel like really there shouldn't be tree plantings going on? Any thoughts there?
You know, we talk about Houston region with many ecosystems, and whether the upland or the prairies or the coastal areas, and the tree planting should also be appropriate to those ecosystems. And I think that's one of the things that we kind of miss. And then also the soil is very different from, say, a deep prairie area versus the coastal areas, upland areas to the riparian areas. And, you know, the plants evolved for many thousands and hundreds of thousands of years based on that sort of conditions, and we should really respect that. But just to add, avoiding planting, well, you know, we're at the point we need more trees. We're at the point we need plant more trees. So looking for appropriate place to plant more trees certainly is the priority.
Great.
Great.
Well, I appreciate all those comments. And let me do a quick plug here. The Tree Strategy Implementation Group has put together a manual that you can find, and I'll talk about it more later, on the Houston Wilderness website under 4.3 million trees. And in that manual, they provide in the appendix some charts, including one that Houston Parks and Rec Department has done that shows different areas where different species do well in some different types of locations and all that, to kind of to KG's point and to several points that were made in the video. So there are some places to reference if you have interest in that regard. How about effects of climate change and expanding the use of native tree species in perhaps large and small scale to kind of work toward accommodating more of that resilience, sustainability that really is on everybody's mind?
I'll jump in on that one to start. We know a lot about different species that work, and as you just said, it depends on what part of town. I mean, in our different mixes, they vary based on, as KG just said, soils, conditions, and all that. One of the challenges that still exists is availability. So we are talking about a much broader range of species, let's say, over the last 10 years. But then it's also who's growing them, who's not growing them. There's a lot of research places out there testing things, and there's info there, but actually getting hundreds or thousands in some case of some species is still a challenge. So I don't know that I don't know that I have the answer. Maybe Matt and KG have an answer, or you, Deborah. But thinking about getting into the availability side so we can continue with that diversity, I think is an issue that we need to tackle. And we're seeing even more of a challenge on availability, as any of you in the industry know, since the freeze this year. So that's also before even the diversity challenge, is how do we get these trees? How do we increase the growing side of it?
So Sheila, I'll add a little bit on selection there. I know we all have really great clients. I mentioned Johnson and Howard Hughes, and their commitment to tree farms, I think, has helped with some of the availability aspect, where they're willing to jump in on some of the Houston Wilderness initiatives and their goals, and try to really push some of these ideas. So I think that's helped with availability. Relative to climate change, you really want to plant the tree where it has the best chance to survive long term. And so what we've done in a lot of our projects is we're really looking at plant communities. So it's not just about the trees, it's about the shrubs. Both KG and Sheila had talked about some of the understory stuff. So it's a system that's working together. And so to have the most successful tree plantings, you really need to have all those elements functioning together to deal with a diversity of issues, whether it's heat, whether it's pests, whether it's, other human-caused issues as well. So really focusing on plant communities, I think, helps with the climate change aspect. And then the ecosystem services that Houston Wilderness has identified with their select trees, I think, is another really important aspect as well.
I think that for the climate change, the biggest thing, of course, is the flooding that we have, the storm, ever increasing strength of the storms that we get hit. And the trees really have many answers for that, creating the sponge, as Sheila said, and then talking about the water system that Matt said, this ecological sort of a piece that the trees provide in terms of carbon sequestration, providing cover for the urban heat island effect, And you know, trees are an important part, and then really provide more resiliencies to the communities, and especially like Sheila was talking about equity issues, and we're going to talk about it some more. But I think that the trees really open up that soil, provides air quality controls. You know, when you have oil service thing blow up during a hurricane or something like that, only way to protect, well, one of the ways to protect air quality really is to have a lot of trees. So, there are many aspects of it, I think.
Well, that's true. And let me mention that on the Houston Wilderness website, if you can go to the 4.6 million tree page, and you can see all these videos in the large scale tree planting manual. If you click on Port of Houston trees, there is research there that shows a list of all our native trees and those ecosystem services divided up by water absorption, greenhouse gas, and carbon sequestration. So if you wanted to know where to find that, and you can also find those 14 what we call super trees, which are really just those trees that rank high in all of those categories. And so obviously they provide a whole lot of ecosystem services if they're planted in large numbers. What I do want to mention also on the availability is of the different tree species is a lot of the statewide tree farmers have gotten the message about this interest in the diversity of trees in our region. And so there is a growing interest in growing more of the different diverse species. So we don't have just live oak or just sycamore and just loblolly, all great, all super trees, but we also want all those others that maybe we don't hear as much about. And so that is growing. There's a couple species still not available yet commercially, but I think there's real interest in making that happen. And then the other thing is the increase in tree farms in our region generally is very exciting. That's really increasing. The developers have gotten into creating tree farms. There's even discussion of doing tree farms within some of the more high health risk areas, where they can go ahead and grow the trees and then turn around and plant them in areas of particular need. And so that's exciting stuff. Style of planting, that forestation style, you all have talked a lot about that. There was a lot of that shown in the video. And then there's also kind of the other style, which is where you have quite a bit of space between trees. Could you talk a little bit about sort of why there would be this interest in the forestation style as a growing area that's beneficial to the region?
Well, when you look at the natural sort of forest, it is sort of the group of trees. And I think there's been a recent studies about how trees are a living thing that are connected by the root system. The one tree helps the other trees, and the younger trees is helping older trees to thrive longer, and so on and so forth. There's some of that kind of interesting sort of studies done. But that is the natural habitat. So trees on 10 foot on center, that's not necessarily natural habitat. That comes out of sort of the agrarian past of our civilization. So, and then we sort of adapted that agricultural pattern into our urban system, and because it fits so well. But to mandate that or to codify that is the right planting, I think that needs to be changed or at least to be looked at it differently.
Yeah, and I think it's also it's touching on some of the things we've said. It's not one design or one answer fits all situations. So it might depend on what space is available, where single rows of a shade tree is what fits. The native, I like what Kate just said about having the native habitat, and that's really more natural. The other thing about having these larger areas is getting that diversity. So stylistically, it's a much more informal style. And again, that doesn't necessarily fit every project. So it's more pastoral in a lot of ways, but I think there's so many good examples of that. And from a cost perspective, it's a very cost effective approach. To do those large areas of reforestation is not very much per square foot compared to a lot of other landscape /hardscape solutions. And I think Matt's pictures out at Cross Creek the way that vast area of swaths of after seeing that for 12 years, and those all started as much smaller material. I think that just is a beautiful feel too, and it's just a different kind of design, really.
Well,
And
we know when you,
sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll build a little bit on KG talking about ecological heritage. I mean, I grew up in a forest in farmland, and that was my experience. I have 2 young kids. They're very familiar with street trees. And so, you know, the idea of kind of nature, adventure, and in addition to the ecosystem service benefits of these large masses, it's reconnecting people to our ecological heritage.
Absolutely.
There's educational aspects. So there's a whole variety of quality of life amenities that are associated with the diversity as well.
You know, when we plant street trees, avoiding telephone poles and street lights, and we end up with a irregular planting. I mean, we can't just keep 30 feet on center planting anyway. So I think the city should recognize that as well, that we want to plant more trees along the streets, and that doesn't mean that it has to be always 30 feet on center.
Right.
Well, that's actually a good point. And of course, as Sheila just said, and you all have all mentioned, you can find examples of these large scale tree plantings all over. We tend to take it for granted because it's been going on for 20 years now, but the TxDOT Houston district really has, you know, on very fairly sometimes thinner spaces along our freeways have managed to fit a whole lot of trees. That's going to be our next TSIG virtual forum, actually, will be TxDOT. And so it is possible, even in areas that would appear to be really harsh environment, they thrive in that forestation style planting with multiple species, and, you know, an opportunity for us to enjoy that really beautiful view. So thank you all on kind of explaining some of those reasons why that forestation style is so important. And hopefully we can keep adding additional places where we can make that happen. You all, I know we've got quite a few questions coming in. I want to give plenty of time for those. I think we've probably covered equity. I think that was the only thing we were going to do a little deeper dive on. Anybody want to have any kind of final thoughts about the urban heat island and kind of the impacts that we can have in some of those areas that maybe haven't tend to spike during those hot summer months? Any other thoughts you think kind of? Okay, well, I know there's a lot.
I think I sort of said my piece already on that.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, good. And I know we've kind of talked about it off and on. Okay, great. So let's get into that Q&A. I'm just going to start at the top, kind of work my way down. I know that you all mentioned a little bit, or somebody did in the video, on how does one obtain that 9 natives for sun and 9 natives for shade? Does somebody want to cover that real quick? I know you can Google it and find it.
I think you can get it. I think you can get it off the Katy Prairie Conservancy site.
I think you're right. Yeah.
I think that's one link. It's also on the Coastal Prairie Partnership site and the Native Prairie Association site.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you, Sheila. That's great. Sure. And then Matt Stallman, who had the last virtual forum on mitigation banks, says great projects. Wondering how available native plant materials have been and what types of native plants are in high demand for these projects. Well, I might want to cover that a little bit. I know that the video showed quite a few different ones.
Well, I mean, it seems like both. I think somebody said this already. It's sort of the whole system, right? It's the trees as well as the understory, and so we are seeing, you know, a lot of demand for a lot of the native grasses. A couple of plants specifically that we see and we use a lot that are possum haw, which is understory, which is great for wildlife. Parsley hawthorn's some of our folks' favorites, but they're really hard to buy, so it's hard to find those. And we also are just, you know, seeing the mixes, looking for everything from yopon to the hawthorns to red maples, some of the native hornbeams and red buds. Those are things we're seeing. Willow oaks, water oaks, cedar elms. All of those seem to be in demand from what we're seeing.
Yeah, and I had mentioned earlier clients. And so, flood control, some of our public-private clients, the tree farm is a big thing. We pretty much plant natives. I mean, there's a lot that, are out there that we don't plant that aren't natives, but the availability thing is really due to a commitment to the people that we work with these tree farms, with, flood control having its own tree farm as well, specifying only natives on the projects. And so there's some that are occasionally difficult to get. Buttonbush is one that I really love.
Oh yeah, I love that.
When you're doing it through commercial landscape companies that can't find it. We've talked to Trees for Houston. They've been able to provide it. There's a few that once in a while we come across, but most of the natives that we specify are available. And if they're not available, one oak, we can find another oak that kind of serves the same function. So I think from the time that I've started to now, the availability has gotten really, really good. Yeah.
That's great. Okay. Next question. Where are the lists of places that could use more trees and or projects that community groups can support to help either through volunteer time or funds? If I could just make a quick shout out about that, and then you all can follow up with that too. I can tell you that both the City of Houston Resilience Office and the Harris County Health Department, I believe it's connected with them, they're working on being able to put together and highlight areas of particular need that then community groups could go in and then support. So I know that those aspects are in the works, but you all might know more in that regard as well.
Well, it's going to sound a little bit like a plug also, but Trees for Houston has, very, very active volunteer program. That's one you could reach out to. And they also look for places around the region. People come to them for partnerships, whether it's communities or organizations, but they also look for, really diversifying, and that Trees for Houston is often looking for people. If somebody has a project that they have identified that they think could really benefit from a tree planting program, you can approach Trees for Houston and they will customize a tree planting program for your project.
That's great.
So a couple of thoughts and places to plant. I think as a landscape architect, we get our hands tied a lot by maintenance. It's like, no, we have to mow that for conveyance. No, that's a utility. You can't put anything there. And it's the, the one time a year that somebody needs to get out there and do this one thing. You have 300 and some odd days that you could really benefit from other plantings, whether they're trees, whether they're woodies, other items. So I think maybe loosening up on some of our perceived notions of what we need to do to maintain these systems would be one way to add. A second thing, kind of a funny story. I know somebody who, he's kind of a Johnny Appleseed, where he goes into city parks and he's putting understory. He's determined that, some of these parks, they've only planted trees and they're missing all the vital understory. And so he's going through and adding all these shrubs that he grows on his own. And it's made a really wonderful system. And so I think when we think about our parks, let's not just think about the overstory, let's think about some of the understory as well. Because I think people dwell on some of the bigger, grander trees, but there's a lot of value in other areas as well.
Well, and I think we're seeing in the development community a lot more openness to that understory. I think 20 years ago, the development community was all about grass and trees. And I think it's really transformed with all of our clients that some of you have mentioned, Matt, us too, are just really more open for that. And they're allowing for that to happen. And that's really changing the kind of the overall ecology.
That's great. And I had mentioned earlier, and I'll just mention again, that this tree strategy implementation group has put together a large scale tree planting manual that you can find under Houston Wilderness and click on programs and then 4.6 million trees. And in there is a section that kind of talks about understory and the different aspects of tree planting, and just kind of thinking about how you might structure a planting to include understory as well as grasses and shrubs and that kind of thing. What partnerships, if any, have been established with builders, developers to encourage the planting of native trees? And you all touched a little bit on this, but you might have a few more thoughts on it.
Well, I think one of the ones is that we are seeing it, as Matt mentioned, and we're seeing it in some of our projects too, is the creation of tree farms. We had a pretty big partnership with Springwoods Village, creating quite a large tree farm that really was looking for diversity of species. That was a partnership with a local grower and Trees for Houston. So it was a three-way partnership, and they're continuing to harvest from that landscape. And I think that partnership has been great. And I think that has broadened, again, what's available, as Matt said, to the communities. And then, there's just other communities and different smaller groups that are doing more grassroots kind of planting, like their own planting on esplanades. I mean, a silly example where I live in Montrose is someone in one of the housing areas, apartments, just decided to go in and take over a boulevard on their own and just add a whole bunch of understory natives under the existing larger trees. So there can be just also grassroots opportunities, not necessarily formal partnerships.
That's great. We do have this question: how many trees are currently growing in Houston? I know that the Texas Forest Service, did that tree inventory, but it's been quite a few years, and I forgot the number. It was big.
I don't know.
Trees are our thing, right? That's what our region does and does well. Is the trees that they establish quickly, and we have such a big list of species that are native to the area, which is neat too. But that one might need a Google to really get that number. But I know it's big. It's a big number for sure.
Yeah, I'll mention the Llewellyn Creek project in Cross Creek. A while back, Deborah was asking for some tree numbers. And it's like, okay, well, we'll look into it. We're 65,000 plus trees just on that one project alone. So, there's big impacts happening. You don't always realize it until you start putting metrics to these things.
No, that's exactly right. And what's really nice about the fact that we have these ecosystem service values now, and we can actually quantify by species, and then, collectively, whether it's a planting of 20 species or a planting of 200,000 species, you can quantify what those ecosystem services are going to be. And it really is phenomenal when you see what those numbers are.
I was thinking we needed an intern, you guys, to go back through 36 years of planting plans in our archives and count the trees off the tree lists.
I was wondering how many dots I actually put on plans over my time here.
Exactly.
No, I know. That was one thing that we talk about policy changes that can be beneficial for additional large-scale tree planting, and there's certainly still a lot of that needs to take place, particularly to allow for these forestation-style plantings and to allow additional places where plantings make sense. Where they either were traditionally, or they're areas that otherwise would be junk grass or whatever anyway. So that's an opportunity for reforestation. But we have, over the last 20 years in our region also, and you all have had a lot of impact on that. We have recognized that we really have an advantage other regions don't have as much of being able to plant in large numbers, and they survive and they do well. I mean, short of something like a bad drought or a bad freeze, they do well here, and so we can really have huge impacts coming together and supporting these large scale tree plantings.